This is the Jonsbo U4. With an external volume of just under 30 liters, the Jonsbo U4 is relatively small for a case capable of housing a full-sized ATX motherboard. Many ATX motherboard supporting cases will have volumes of 40, 50, or even 60 liters. Equipped with a tempered glass side panel and a minimalistic design, the relatively compact size and aesthetics come at a price. In the USA, the Jonsbo U4 retails for $100 to $130 before rebate, costing $70 after rebate when I purchased my unit from B&H Photo in early 2019. Including only a single 120mm fan in the stock configuration, can this case justify the price? Let's find out. Personally, I quite like the visual qualities of the case. Keep in mind, an internally white and internally black version of the case exists, but my model has a red interior despite the B&H Photo stock images showing an all-black internal. As mentioned, the Jonsbo U4 is relatively small for a case capable of housing an ATX motherboard. The U4 measures 16.9 inches tall, 8.1 inches wide, and 13.4 inches deep, creating a relatively tall and narrow footprint held up by 4 rubber-bottomed feet. Maximum CPU cooler height is 170mm, while maximum GPU length is 310mm. Keep that GPU length in mind. We'll be coming back to that. The darkly colored tempered glass side panel is easily removed via thumb screws, and the panel sits slightly recessed, ensuring that it won't drop straight down when all 4 thumb screws are removed. Although, it does have a tendency to tip out from the top, so you'll need to be careful about that. Once inside the case, you'll immediately notice the power supply cover panel. This is not a full shroud as seen in many cases at this price point, but rather a single sheet of textured metal that simply sits vertically behind the glass side panel. The power supply cover panel is easily removed by 2 small screws. Note the small engraved front written on the outer, visible side of the power supply cover panel. A little unnecessary in my opinion, as the power supply cover panel only fits one way into the case, so the front engraving is just a bit unneeded visible marring. The good news is, it's hard to see the front engraving through the tempered glass side panel. Further inside the case, you can see a removable internal front panel. 2 simple Phillips head screws later, and you can easily remove the internal panel from the 3 supporting pegs nestled on the motherboard tray side of the case. Upon inspection of this internal front panel, you'll find mounting holes for up to 2 120mm fans and a magnetic dust filter, as well as mounting holes for 2 2.5-inch solid-state drives or hard drives. Most 120mm fans will fit on the outer side of this internal panel, but doing so will cram them in with less than 5mm of breathing room from the front exterior of the case. I highly advise front 120mm fans be placed on the inside of this front internal panel for that very reason. Speaking of the outer front panel, it is not removable. It is completely solid aluminum, and the only ventilation is on the right side through a series of roughly 1-inch long slits. This provides very little room for cool intake air to be pulled from the front of the case, and I was not optimistic when starting thermal testing. More on that soon. Opposite of the right side ventilation slits, the left side of the panel holds a small silver power button, 2 USB 3.0 ports, a headphone port, and a microphone port. On the front is a very simple Jonsbo font in silver lettering. Refocusing our attention to the inside of the case, we see space at the bottom for another 120mm intake fan. The dust filter for this fan is located along the entire length of the bottom of the case, and this dust filter also is used to filter air pulled in by the power supply. Somewhat annoyingly, the dust filter is trapped by the case's 4 feet. You literally have to unscrew all 4 feet to remove the dust filter for cleaning. This is not ideal by any means. One concern with this bottom-mounted fan: it sits quite close to the cables leading out from your power supply. Even with fully modular cables, I found it difficult to position the cables in a way that wouldn't cause them to potentially sit on top of the spinning fan, and so I opted to simply not use this fan mount position for anything but a depository for my cables. By the way, the power supply sits slightly elevated from the bottom of the case thanks to 4 small circular rubberized pads. Looking towards the back of the case, we see your standard Pcie slots. The covers for the Pcie slots are removed by a Phillips head screw, which is covered by a PCI cover slot, also removed by a Phillips head screw, and the PCIe slot covers can be replaced quite easily. No annoying tearaway cover slots. At the top of the back panel, we see the included 120mm fan. Although I didn't do any testing on the fan noise, this 3-pin fan seems to have a good airflow without being overly noisy based on a purely subjective assessment. Finally, let's look at the motherboard tray. Well, rather, let's look at the inside wall of the case. You see, there is no motherboard tray. To achieve its relatively compact dimensions, Jonsbo elected to remove any room to hide cables. That's right, there's literally nowhere to hide cables under or behind the motherboard. So, with the wide open view from the tempered glass side panel, you will need to be very creative with your cable management. Thankfully, Jonsbo included several accessories to help with cable management. In addition to the adhesive cable loops, several other accessories were included, such as the motherboard speaker for air beeps and standard zip ties, as well as many extra screws. One interesting problem arose during some of my test builds. Using a larger graphics card, such as my Sapphire Radeon R9 290X Tri-X, which measures 305mm in length, it interfered with mounting of the bottom of the two front 120mm fans. So, you'll need a graphics card that is approximately 285mm or shorter to fit a standard 25mm thick fan in the bottom of those two slots. You can probably stretch that a bit if you get a thinner fan, such as a 15mm fan. Just something to keep in mind when picking out your graphics card. All things said, the case looks quite nice and wasn't overly difficult to build in, but I strongly advise you to minimize cables as much as possible. M.2 drives are quite handy in this case. A modular power supply is pretty much a necessity. I tried building with a non-modular power supply and found it to be quite painful, to say the least. I would also recommend power supplies with shorter cables, or even getting custom cables made to eliminate any extra length, or use the extra length to try and hide the cables along the inner frame of the case itself. I ran several brief tests to determine temperatures in the case in 3 configurations. The stock configuration using only a single 120mm exhaust fan in the back, the stock fan and configuration with the side glass panel completely removed, and a final configuration with the side panel attached, the stock rear 120mm fan as exhaust, and 2 120mm fans in the front as intake with the included filter in place. Idle temperatures were perfectly fine for both the CPU and GPU, with or without the glass on, with or without the extra 2 front fans. Running the Heaven benchmark, which primarily stresses the GPU, we don't see major differences in terms of GPU temperatures with or without the side panel, with or without the extra 2 front fans, but we do notice that with the glass side panel off, the CPU temperature drops about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. Looking at the ASUS Realbench stress test, we find the GPU temperatures don't really change too significantly, but again we see that the CPU temperature, even with just the 2 front fans, does drop by about 5 degrees Celsius compared to the stock configuration. For this test, really no extra improvement was made when the glass side panel was removed. Looking at the Furmark GPU stress test, we again find no major differences in terms of the GPU temperatures, but we do see a noticeable difference in the CPU temperatures, probably as a runoff from all the heat being put out by the GPU itself. In the stock configuration, we see almost 27 degrees Celsius over ambient for the CPU. When we add 2 front fans, that drops by about 5 degrees Celsius. And when we take the glass side panel off, we see another drop of almost 5 degrees Celsius. Although these tests are relatively simplistic and not fully in-depth, a small takeaway can be teased out here. The stock configuration, compared to the 2 front intake fan configuration, or especially the side panel removed configuration, generally results in a noticeably warmer CPU. Now, this system was not highly overclocked, but for a highly overclocked CPU, the stock configuration will likely be a little hazardous. With that in mind, if you're running your components at stock speeds and voltages, adding in 2 front intake fans is a simple and effective means to keep temperatures relatively in check. If you plan to aim for a high overclock on your CPU and or your GPU, I would begin to be a little bit worried about this case's ability to remove hot air and bring in fresh air, especially with the very limited front panel ventilation. With those results in mind, would I recommend the Jonsbo U4? Well, I'd recommend it only if either of the 2 following factors apply to you. You want a relatively small footprint case to hold your ATX motherboard, or you really like the way the case happens to look. It isn't priced very aggressively, and the design leaves something to be desired regarding thermal performance and stock configuration. To conclude, the case does an acceptable job of filling a size niche, but beyond that, it wouldn't be a highly recommended case in my opinion. So, let me know your thoughts about the Jonsbo U4. With that said, that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.